Now there's one question that bugs people, and that is, why is it addressed to these 7 churches? I mean, there's other churches in the area. Colossae, that's mentioned in the New Testament, is just over the mountain from Laodicea, but they're not included. So why these 7 churches? And that's puzzled a lot of people, and probably will continue. And it may be that they are meant to represent the whole area. That these 7 churches, by writing to these 7 churches, he means to be writing to the whole region. But the text doesn't say that. It says to the 7 churches, and the personal traits of these short letters, the personal details, would mitigate against the idea that he was writing to the whole area. It seems that he's writing to the 7 churches. Some would say, well, 7 churches, 7 is a number in Revelation we'll talk about later that talks about all of God's work, and so that means all the churches. Maybe, but we're really not into the vision proper yet. And once again, all these personal details just would mitigate against that. And again, there's just nothing in the text that points to the idea that it's really addressed to all the churches in the area. It appears to be addressed to these 7. Some have looked at these 7 churches and asserted that they refer to 7 ages of church history, 7 frames of church history between the first century church and the end of time. For example, Ephesus is a church that's lost its first fervor. And this would point, they would say, to the state of the church when the letter is begun. Some of that early fire with the apostles and things is now languishing, and so that's Ephesus. And then Pergamum, they would say, is a representative of the church that married the state, pointing to the 4th century when Constantine draws the church alongside the Roman government, and the church moves from being persecuted to being in power. And so they would say that's Pergamum right there. Thyatira is the Dark Ages, 590 A.D. and Sardis is the days of the Reformation, and Laodicea is the lukewarm nature of the present church. That's kind of the breakdown. It may vary a little bit from that depending on the person doing the interpreting, but that's the idea, that each of these churches represents different ages of the church history. But there's several problems with this. Number one, there is no way the original readers could have understood this. There is nothing in the text that suggests that. The letter, as it appears, is written to them. And the letter would have been meaningless to them, or at least these 2 chapters, if that's the interpretation of what's going on. Secondly, this idea that the churches represent different ages is very Western-centric and very present-day centric. Now, what about the church in Africa and Asia and South America and in the East? They're all left out. This interpretation just follows the church through Western history, through our history. And the scheme is set up so that it ends in the present day. Now, there's a good chance, as there always is, that the Lord can come back at any time. There's a good chance the Lord could come back today, and that this is the end age. But there's also a good chance that it may be 100 years from now and the church may be drastically different. Or he could have came back 100 years ago. And the point being is, this interpretation is very much centered around our history, when our history is not the whole history of the church. The church has much more history besides just the Western European American story. In the end, the idea of the 7 churches representing 7 ages of church history is just being forced upon the text. The assumption is that the vision this vision that starts in chapter 4 is about the end of the world. And so, how do we get to the end of the world? Well, it's trying to force chapters 2 and 3 to get us from the 1st century to the end of the world. And there's really no reason to do that. There's no reason in the text that would point to that. The last possibility is that, or the last one I know of, is that It's a Roman way of designating prominent cities. Rome designated prominent cities in regions. And it was more than just renown. Prominent cities held special status before the Roman government. They were seen as the lead cities through the whole region. And so maybe these are the lead cities. These are God's lead cities through the region. And maybe that's why he chooses these 7. In the end, there is nothing in the text that points to these 7 churches being anything other than 7 congregations in Asia Minor at the time that the letter is written. Why only 7? In the end, we probably don't know. But there's nothing in the text that points beyond these 7 congregations. Chapter 4 then begins. I will show you what must take place after this. And so the vision of the future begins. And that's probably what most people are wanting to get to when they study Revelation. And we will get to that next time. But before we do, let's take one quick note of something we've learned already. I find it so interesting that God is intent with what's going on with these 7 individual congregations. Like we said, there's other congregations in the world, in Africa, India, Persia, Greece. But God lets them know that they're not lost in the midst of all the congregations. Each congregation is personal to God. This whole thing is very personal to God. His congregations aren't numbers, they're names. He walks among them. He ministers to them. He sends their angels. Their candlestick is in His care. As I'm recording this, we're in a strange time. This is the time of COVID-19 quarantine and social distancing, and a lot of churches are wondering what the future holds. It's kind of tough when the government officially calls you non-essential. And so we worry what's going to happen in the future. But we know this, and that is that God is mindful of us. He knows our name. There is power that God's people hold. Not the political power, but the personal power. That's what Revelation is about. The personal power we have because of our relationship with God. And that's a resource that makes all the difference when life gets hard. And that's where we'll pick up next time as we get into chapter 4. We'll see you then.